What does it mean to be isolated? What effect does distance and isolation have on all of us? I live in a packed city with neighbours on every side. I can hear them going about their lives, walking on the ceiling above me. I'm both isolated and surrounded. As the UK enters almost a month of lockdown, I have been drawn to think more about how the concept of isolation has seeped into the music I spend a lot of my time performing. For centuries, seclusion has been regarded as the ultimate way to connect with learning, enlightenment, or a higher power. Antoine Girard de Saint-Amand's poem La Solitude focuses on this transformative power of retreating from the noise of everyday life. English poet Catherine Phillips translated this poem, and Purcell chose 3 verses to set to music in O Solitude, my sweetest choice. It's worth noting, in fact, that Catherine Phillips lived in seclusion. She was very successful in her day, but chose to live away from London, away from her literary colleagues, from her fans, and chose to write and be quiet in a more secluded life. The phrase "O Solitude" repeats 8 times throughout Purcell's setting of the poem. It's almost like a refrain. The melodic idea is always falling in more and more chromatic intervals. In fact, the first 2 times we hear O Solitude, it falls by a 7th and then by a diminished 5th. Purcell encapsulates perfectly that pull between the rewards and the disappointments of a life in isolation. For Antoine Girard, solitude is something he pursues and something he hates. Purcell calls this setting a song upon a ground. It is written on a ground bass, which repeats perfectly throughout the piece. There is no variation. It's a 4-bar phrase that can be heard continuously from the beginning to the end. Whilst the bass line remains very constant, the vocal line is anything but. Purcell weaves an extraordinary vocal line. It's full of irregular phrase lengths, interrupting phrases, overlapping phrases, not necessarily always starting at the same time as the new ground bass. And so the listener and the performer get lost within the structure, and Solitude's hypnotic inevitability takes over. If isolation is not a sweet choice, then we must consider how else it must arise. Seclusion is one thing, but expulsion or exclusion is a far more dangerous route to isolation. This could be in the form of physically being left behind, or perhaps an emotional abandonment. Betrayal, infidelity, and switches of allegiance are pivotal plot points in any story, and always elicit huge change in both the emotional and physical circumstances. I have chosen an extraordinary piece by Barbara Strozzi. This is L'Eraclito Amoroso, Heraclitus in Love. Here, infidelity has led to absence. But Heraclitus decides that this place of emotional isolation is safe. The pain of loss brings joy. Every silence, every lament delights him. It brings reminiscence of love lost, but also the reassurance of no future pain. L'Eraclito Amoroso is a wonderful example of stile rappresentativo, a style that developed in opera and song in the late 16th century. It's a heightened form of recitative, somewhere between recitative and song. So more expressive than speech, but not quite as florid as song. Strozzi approaches both ends of this in L'Eraclito Amoroso. The outer sections feel very close to recitative. They're spoken quickly and mainly completely syllabic, whereas the middle sections are extraordinarily heartfelt and very sung. She employs really long melismas on many of the important verbs and follows a falling ground bass, a slightly less complex one than the one we heard from Purcell earlier, to outline the joy she finds in her laments. Bach's cantata for solo alto, Vergnügterruhe, was written for the 6th Sunday after Trinity and first performed in Leipzig in 1726. It was written, like all of Bach's cantatas, to respond to the readings for the day. And in this case, this included Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. Jesus here talks about justice and whether there is more to justice than just obeying the rules of earth, but in fact following heavenly rules, heavenly laws as well. And the whole cantata extrapolates on this theme, exploring that pull between the want of heavenly life and the sins of earthly life. I've chosen just to share the first movement with you today, though I would of course suggest to immediately listen to the rest of the cantata. There are many wonderful recordings available, so do have a little listen, because it's wonderful to put this piece in its whole context. But it's a little long to share the whole thing with you today, and so it's just the first movement that we will be looking at. This first movement is not a typical da capo aria that we might expect of Bach's cantatas. In fact, Vergnügterruhe, that phrase, that blessed rest, keeps recurring, a little bit like O Solitude did. We hear it again and again, interrupting the phrases. And so, although the text looks like it might fit that da capo, that repeating A, B, A form, in fact, Bach keeps referring to Vergnügterruhe over and over again. Each call seems to be crying out, pleading for that rest, that seclusion, but it also acts as a prayer, committing to that rest and a life dedicated to finding virtue and peace in the heart. Claudio Monteverdi's Voglio di vita uscir, I want to leave this life, explores another need for isolation, a need to disappear. Again, it's seeking isolation through an active choice. It's the last resort for this unrequited lover, but nonetheless, he wants the earth to open and swallow him up. This soliloquy is built in the form of a chaconne. That two-bar phrase that you hear at the very beginning, played by the harpsichord, is used in quite a free way, not repeated continuously throughout the piece, but heard again and again in a patchwork of different keys, with short interspersing passages linking them together. Much like the Strozzi, L'Eraclito Amoroso, which you heard earlier, the second half of this song winds down into a slower triple time section. It leaves space for far more flexibility in the vocal line and contrasts hugely to that virtuosic and florid first half, as finally the departure, that isolation that has been called for, has been reached, and we relax into the tomb.
Il mio
To finish, we turn Solitude on its head and look to one of Handel's typical heroes, Julius Caesar. A plot to kill Caesar has just been discovered, and Cleopatra begs him to stay, to hide, to run, to spare his life. But this threat of isolation becomes our hero's motivation to go out to battle. Caesar refuses to run and hide. He doesn't want to give in to that plot, and instead leaps forward into battle, knowing that his resolve and strength will protect him.
Al lampo dell'armi questa magriere vendetta farà. Al lampo dell'armi questa magriere vendetta farà, vendetta farà. Questa è magriera. Al lampo dell'armi questa magriere vendetta farà. Al lampo dell'armi questa magriera vendetta farà, vendetta farà. Al lampo dell'armi questa è magriera vendetta farà. Al lampo dell'armi questa è magriera vendetta farà. Questa alma guerriera vendetta farà. Non fia che disarmi la destra guerriera che forza le dà. Non fia che disarmi la destra guerriera che forza le dà. La destra guerriera che forza le dà.